Good evening, I'm Yvonne, Staff for Science for the Public, and along with the Union of Concerned Scientists, I welcome you to tonight's panel on what the public needs to know about fracking. The great increase in hydraulic fracking has occurred with weak regulations, inadequate information from the industry, and very few substantive studies on health effects. So we urge you to check the excellent resources on fracking produced by the Union of Concerned Scientists. You can see it on their website, the literature out there. Our website has the link to their wonderful forum on it, webinar, and so on. And then on the handout for this thing tonight, on the back you'll find the URLs as well. We are very honored to have 4 experts to discuss the potential environmental and health impacts of fracking with us tonight. I'm going to introduce them alphabetically. Maybe they'll raise their hands since they're not in alphabetical seating order. And I'll do that very briefly, and you'll see some information on the back of the sheet here and on our website, I think a little more. And so here is what we'll do. We'll shift to Pallavi, who is the moderator, and she'll handle it from after we get started. And after they finish, we'll have a QA session, and I'll just ask you to shout out your questions. So our first panelist, by alphabetical order again, is Aaron Bernstein, Dr. Aaron Bernstein. He's the Associate Director for the Center for Health and Global Environment at the Harvard School of Public Health and several other things. He's led an uphill battle to fund and develop comprehensive studies on the health effects of fracking. William Mumma is Professor of International Environmental Policy and Director of the Center for International Environment and Resource Policy at Tufts University. Dr. Mumma, along with other members of the International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, won the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize along with the rest of the panel and Al Gore. He's participated in a number of debates, especially at his institution on fracking. Our moderator, Pallavi Fartial, is a senior analyst and program manager at the Center for Science and Democracy at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Her background is in cellular and molecular biology, and Dr. Fartial previously served as project director at the Research Competitiveness Program of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Andrew Rosenberg is the director of the Center for Science and Democracy at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Dr. Rosenberg previously served as senior vice president for science and knowledge at the Conservation International. He's also served as deputy director of the National Marine Fisheries Service at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, known as NOAA. And he has been instrumental in developing the excellent UCS information on fracking. After the panel discussion, we will open the floor for questions. I know we are all going to learn a lot, and now I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Fartial, and please welcome our distinguished guests. Thank you.
Thanks, Yvonne. And thank you to Science for the Public for organizing this event. As you probably all know, fracking has sort of become the issue of our times. If you're not in a state that is affected by fracking, you probably know somebody else who is affected by fracking. It is taking place in more than 28 states in the country at this point, so more than half the country is faced with decisions on hydraulic fracturing, sometimes interchangeably called fracking. At the Union of Concerned Scientists, we recently launched a new initiative called the Center for Science and Democracy, which is what Andy and I are part of. And the purpose for the center is to really strengthen the role that science and evidence plays in public policy. And this goes across specific topics. And while we try to increase the demand for science and evidence to inform our decisions, we also try to hold media, our policymakers, and corporations accountable for their decision-making processes. So it's an ambitious undertaking, and we try to do it systematically at the federal level, but we are also trying to focus on specific topics that do have an integral component of science as well as democratic dialogue and processes inbuilt into it. And fracking seemed like a very opportune topic for that for us, because fracking touches on a lot of scientific aspects: the air, the water, landscape, ecology, noise pollution, sound pollution, all kinds of things, and social studies that inform what goes on with fracking, as well as our decision making based on what we know and what we don't know. So at the Center for Science and Democracy at UCS, we tried to undertake a body of work in the past year, including a forum, a public forum that we held jointly with the University of California at Los Angeles in July of this year, where we brought together 75 experts from very different sectors and different professions, different fields. These were lawyers, these were decision makers, these were leaders from the community, academics, and government officials, as well as folks from the industry, to really come together and have an honest discussion about what is known, what is not known, and how do we really engage a community on decisions that impact them before development, not after the decision has been made. That was a forum, it was a 2-day event. We had 1.5 days of expert discussions, and then we had a half day of public conversation on that. We also, following that, released a report. There are copies of this outside. This is a report on what are the barriers to information on fracking. This is a complicated issue, and oftentimes people hear from two extreme sides of the conversation. You know, industry says one thing, environmentalists say one thing, and it's hard for public to access and really ascertain what the information is. So we have a comprehensive report on the barriers and what we know and what we don't know. We've also released recently a toolkit, a fracking information toolkit, really for communities that are faced with decision making on fracking. And the toolkit lays out the kinds of questions you should be asking while you're in the process of making a decision. It also equips you with the various stakeholders that are part of this conversation and how you can be an active citizen, an informed citizen, and really hold your policymakers accountable to make the right choice. With that, that's sort of some of the work we've been doing, and I hope you'll pick up some of the literature as you walk out. I think I'll turn it over to our panel here. And I really want to leave a lot of room for question and answers, because I'm sure people have lots of questions on this. And we have, fortunately, 3 experts with us today. To my right, Dr. Muma, who will be talking primarily about the climate impacts of fracking. Dr. Bernstein, who would be talking about health effects of fracking. And then finally, Dr. Rosenberg, who will talk about the policy and regulatory structure and how we are regulating fracking. He'll also touch upon public access to information on fracking. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Muma.
Thank you very much, Pallavi. And thank you all for coming. It is always the goal of the Union of Concerned Scientists to have an informed public, and only with an informed public can we get the best decisions. I'm not going to run through the usual story of climate change. I think you all know that. We are putting gases in the atmosphere that are trapping heat, and the Earth is warming up, and we are seeing some fairly unpleasant consequences of that. But what you may not be aware of is that in the recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that came out in September, for the first time, they described a carbon budget. How much carbon dioxide can we put in the atmosphere to stay below a particular target? That target is a somewhat arbitrary one, frankly. It says we should keep the temperature of the Earth below 2 degrees Celsius, that's 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. To do that, we have to keep the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere below about 450 parts per million. There are many of us who think that we are already seeing At less than half of that rise, we're seeing effects that we'd rather not have, and that will only get worse. But nevertheless, that's kind of the target that the governments of the world have set out to meet. And next week, well, in the week, and actually right now and next week, the meetings are in Warsaw to try to come to some sort of international agreement. Now, this target has implications. If we were to meet it, we would have to leave something like 2/3 of all the fossil fuels that we know we can get out of the ground, and that number was determined before fracking. With fracking, the number is probably more like 80%, maybe even more, of all the fossil fuels that we know we can get out of the ground with current technology have to stay in the ground, or else we will exceed the 2-degree number. That's quite an astounding finding. A number of organizations have pointed out what they call stranded assets. If you were holding stock in a fossil fuel company, an oil company, a coal company, and they can't take it out of the ground, that stock's not going to be worth very much in a few years. But we have to see whether or not that can actually be done. But just as we thought we were probably going to make some progress on this, everything seemed to go the wrong direction. The Canadians started pumping up their production of tar sands oil, which is really a big carbon emitter, and we began fracking for natural gas. We've only been doing this now really in any amounts for about the past 5 years. So what does it mean? I mean, the numbers are, they're hard to fathom. Shale gas that's recoverable is estimated to be 7,400 trillion cubic feet. The world is using about 113 per year. So the fracking gas alone is enough to last 67 years at current amounts, just to give you a number. That's just the fracking gas, and that's not the majority of gas in the world. So we have the capacity to put into the atmosphere something between 5 and 10 times as much heat-trapping gases as we have already put into the atmosphere. That is, we can technologically and probably economically do that. Now, I don't know who's going to pay the bills for all the damage that ensues, but just to give you a sense, that's where things are. And right now, today, that's where the money is getting that stuff out of the ground and transferring the carbon that's in the fuels to carbon dioxide as a heat-trapping gas in the atmosphere. Now, fracking and natural gas generally has a second component. Namely, it's made up about 95% of methane, which is a very strong heat-trapping gas. On the day that you put a pound of methane in the atmosphere, it has 102 times the global warming as carbon dioxide, a pound of carbon dioxide put in on that same day. But it does disappear pretty fast, and after 25 years, after 100 years, it has about 25 times the heat trapping of carbon dioxide. So it's a big heat trapper. Now, the problem is we use natural gas. I'm sure many of us in this room use natural gas to cook with and maybe to heat our homes with. And there have been studies where trucks drive around the Boston area with little methane sniffers. And indeed, we're leaking methane from our ancient natural gas distribution system. We are leaking it from the big pipelines. We have something, I saw a figure, 60 million miles of distribution natural gas pipes and over 1 million miles of transportation gas pipelines in this country alone. And they all leak to some extent. Natural gas is leaked when it's produced. But in the case of fracking, there is more that is leaked than when you produce natural gas from more conventional sources. Because we punch a big hole in the ground, we dump a bunch of stuff down there, force it down, crack open the rocks, and release the gas. And as the gas is released, a good deal of it escapes before it can be captured and put into a pipeline or something to get it to us so that we can cook our meals and heat our homes. So here's the concern. What is the total amount of heat trapping that we're going to get from all this extra natural gas that we're going to be using? Now here's an interesting, everyone says, well, you know, the great thing about natural gas is it's displacing coal right now, particularly in the power sector. The US is using almost 25% less coal today than it was as recently as 2007. That's an amazing transformation. We went from something like 52% of electricity being generated by coal to 39% in the past year or so. But that's not all due to natural gas, by the way. In part, that's due to the introduction of very large-scale wind turbines, solar, PV panel installations, and so forth. But nevertheless, gas is responsible for pushing some coal out of the system. But if gas is leaking at any very large rate, it doesn't help us very much. The Climate Central has done they have a little calculator on their website, which is really cool to use. You can see if it leaks at this rate, and if we have this much of it replacing coal, how good is it? And here's one finding. For example, if for any methane leakage rate that's greater than 6%, it is at least 20 years before any global warming benefit at all is realized. So even though methane or natural gas rather, is twice as efficient as coal, you produce twice as much energy for the same amount of carbon that you burn. It's really a good deal in that regard. But unfortunately, if it's leaking this amount, it takes a very long time before you are as good as coal. And we know coal is not very good at all. So this is the big concern about the increase in fracking from a climate point of view. Bob Horwath at Cornell University has concluded that the global warming potential averaged over the whole country is from fracking is worse than coal. Industry disagrees. Industry says their leakage rate at the wellhead is 1%. There are measurements in the western states of Utah and Wyoming that show that in some cases it's 12%. I suspect both those numbers are true. The big gas companies say that it's the wildcatters that are the 12% and they are the 1%. But we need to have a more systematic way to measure this to be sure what the numbers really are. The point is they're not zero. Even the industry acknowledges that. So we have here a major challenge. Even if the methane weren't leaking, we have to leave most of this gas in the ground if we're going to avoid a severe climate problem. And while the industry likes to say that natural gas is a bridge to the future, a future of all renewables without any carbon emissions, I think it may be just a pier that ends to nowhere. Thank you.
Dr. Bernstein?
Sure. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. I think Yvonne may have stolen my thunder. I'm here to talk about the health effects of hydraulic fracturing, or what I would speak to more broadly people call unconventional natural gas development. We don't know very much. And I suppose I could stop there, but they've asked me to speak for 10 minutes, so I guess I'll keep going. So here's a question for you. How many, you heard from Bill that, we've moved from roughly 50% coal to now somewhere around 40% coal for electricity. How many people in the room chose coal as their primary energy source? How many people voted for coal or said, I want coal delivered to my house, or anybody? No, and that's because those decisions were made a long time ago. So the reason we have coal in large part is, it's like, if you build it, they will come. We have coal infrastructure. We know how to get coal out of the ground. We have distribution networks for coal. Most of the rail traffic in the United States used for shipping coal around. And I live in Jamaica Plain. There's still a coal chute in my 2-floor apartment. And you could, if there were coal, we could put the coal down. So it turns out that this is a pretty radical transition in not just US history, but in really human history, the transition in our energy sources that's going on now, of which unconventional natural gas development is a part, is really quite extraordinary for people alive today. This is not something that happens very often in human history. And we actually have a say in what happens, especially in the United States. And my thoughts about hydraulic fracturing as a physician and someone who spends a lot of time thinking about public health is when we have options on the table, we would better understand what's at stake for our health before we build chutes in everyone's basement for coal to be delivered. Because if we invest in that infrastructure, it's not going to be next year when we say, well, you know, we just spent $100 billion developing infrastructure for natural gas, and yeah, we don't really want to use that anymore. And I think a lot of the decisions, a lot of the things that my colleagues at the School of Public Health have been making their careers on, which is air pollution related to coal, is a future I don't want to give my students. I don't want my students in 50 years to be going around saying, well, we're going to study the health effects of hydraulic fracturing and developing natural gas as a career, and showing that, in fact, and this is data that our center has put out, if you look at the health costs of using coal for electricity, its fair market value far exceeds any alternative. Way more expensive than wind, way more expensive than solar. But you know, we're not paying for that in our electricity bill. We're paying for it in the children I see at Boston Children's showing up at the emergency room not able to breathe, right? So the issue of hydraulic fracturing is huge in terms of what it means for climate change, which is obviously, or maybe not so obviously, a huge public health concern. But it also has great relevance to the direct health effects associated with this practice. Now, the scope of potential harms is large. There's reason to be concerned on any number of levels. The trouble is, we really have the foggiest idea as to how severe those potential harms are, and it's a moving target. So you heard about the wildcats versus, you know, big industry. Has anyone here been to southwestern Pennsylvania? Okay. So what's south, so you can speak up, but what is southwest, so first of all, are you from southwestern Pennsylvania? Yes, okay. So you grew up there? Yes. Grew up in southwestern, and you've been back recently. Yes. What's different?
Well, you know, fracking is starting there. It hasn't established itself deeply there yet, but my neighbors, there's a, you know, they're digging a well, there are trucks going back and forth down through the side roads where I grew up.
How many people lived in the town you grew up in?
I grew up on a farm.
Okay.
But the town was very small.
Right.
Maybe 200-300 people.
So this is a classic story from in western or southwestern Pennsylvania, towns of 200 and 300 people, people who've known each other for generations. Families have lived in these places a long time. The communities are largely farm-based agrarian communities, and all of a sudden there are wells popping up on the landscape. So you have some families saying, I want the money from the lease on the land. And they sign agreements with corporations which tell them that should harms arise from this, you are not allowed to tell anyone, under any circumstances, anything. And other neighbors saying, we don't want anything to do with this. And it sets up a dynamic that is, at best, not productive, and at worst, takes people who have known each other for very long times and makes them hostile towards each other. And this is a dynamic we're seeing all over rural parts of the United States. So many people think about the air issues, many people think about the water issues, some people think about the fact we're triggering earthquakes, which we are, or half a dozen other things. But first and foremost right now is because of where these fuels are and because of where the technology is deployable, mostly this is occurring in places of the country that are rural, poor, and there are huge community social justice issues as well. Aside from Pennsylvania, the other area that is particularly impressive and can be seen from outer space for anyone who's looked at NASA's website is the Bakken Shale in North Dakota. It actually is the most amazing images. Over the last decade, NASA's been taking pictures of North Dakota, and the western part of the state where almost no one lives has become as bright as any part of the country. I mean, it literally lights up from outer space. And that's not natural gas they're getting out of the ground there, it's mostly oil. And so it's an interesting problem because not only are there huge things at stake potentially for climate change, for the health of the communities and where it's being developed, for the health of people who are breathing the combustion byproducts of these issues, but it is happening out of sight of most people who are benefiting from this production. So we have a few people from places in the country, but we're probably not going to see fracking in Massachusetts. I mean, there may be a touch of gas under the western part of the state, but it's not going to be the first place that anyone goes. And so for people who are concerned, it's actually purely an non-experiential event. So we don't live in parts of the country, mostly, Americans don't live in parts of the country that's happening. So we have something that is being billed as the golden goose. It's going to get us off coal. It's going to have potentially a lower carbon footprint. People in public health say it's healthier than burning coal. So when you burn coal, you get tremendous amounts of particulate pollution. When you burn gas, don't get so much of that. And the effects upon the parts of the country that it is occurring in are not easily visible to most people. So that's a public health challenge right there. The other thing that makes it a public health challenge is it's very hard for us to know what's going on. One, because of these agreements that I mentioned, where we as public health experts, so as a physician, if I were taking care of a person who is presumably harmed by a well on their property, I may have a hard time actually knowing how they were harmed because the contents of the chemicals they were exposed to may not be available to me. I won't necessarily know that. But, of course, many of you will know that the practice of hydraulic fracturing nationwide has been exempted from various protections, including the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Clean Water Act. This was arranged, these are called the Halliburton loophole, negotiated when Dick Cheney was head of Halliburton, and they persist to this day. So there's been knowledge barriers in terms of understanding what exposures may be going on. Up until very recently, corporations were not disclosing what was in the fluids they were using to frack. So when you make one of these wells, you drill a hole in the ground and then you put millions of gallons of fluid, most of which is water, but a very small percentage of which is chemicals. It turns out that most of those chemicals are actually not so bad, but they didn't want to tell people anyway. What's more concerning actually is what's in the water once it comes out of the ground, the so-called produced water. But even that we have a hard time studying in many cases. So there's reason to be concerned. We have a very limited understanding of what people's exposures are and to what extent. There's real questions about if we bring this to scale, if natural gas is really going to become the lion's share of energy, what does that mean for people's exposures? What does that mean for water-related exposures, air exposures, effects on communities, so forth? So we've got a tremendous amount of work to do to understand what's at stake so that I don't have students in 50 years' time who are making their career studying the health effects of natural gas produced by unconventional development. But I very much want to hear from you what your questions are about health-related effects of fracking when we get to that. So I look forward to that. Thanks for your attention.
Andy?
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. This is a really interesting issue, and the reason why the Center for Science and Democracy at UCS took it on is because it's an issue that touches people directly. If you live in a community where fracking is occurring, or you're thinking about energy future either in your own community or nationwide or globally, you can connect to this issue of hydraulic fracturing and natural gas production or unconventional oil production quite directly. And that means that it's worth understanding some of the science that is available and what should be available before those decisions are made. We should be clear that fracking or hydraulic fracturing, we're using that term to talk about the entire exploration, development, production process for unconventional oil and gas. It's not just about natural gas. If you watch the television ads, it's all about natural gas being the future of the country. A large proportion of the fracking that's going on now is for oil. In the Bakken, in Texas, in California, where they now estimate the largest oil reserve in the lower 48 is, and probably larger than Alaska. If they proceed, as they will, with fracking in California in the Monterey Shale, it will be for oil. The reason the Bakken is all lit up is not because they're shining a lot of lights so they can see the work, it's because they're flaring off the natural gas. They just burn off the gas. They don't want it. It's not worth saving and piping into New England or anywhere else. So it's about unconventional oil and gas development. It's an enormous resource, and it's an enormous economic opportunity for companies and for people working in those companies. And you can't pretend that it's not an economic opportunity in a rural community that may have very few economic opportunities left as small farms are struggling, or as what might have been other opportunities in manufacturing has gone away. This looks like a good opportunity for tax revenue, for potentially jobs, and so on. There was a recent report that was commissioned by the American Petroleum Institute, so you should be careful, that was about the economics of the natural gas production in the United States, basically enabled by hydraulic fracturing. And its conclusion was this is an enormous economic boom. Any regulation will essentially entirely stymie the American economy, and there are no costs, as far as I could tell. So it was like reporting half of a baseball score, you know, because it didn't report any public costs. UCS got into this issue because there, of course, are public costs, and it's worth people asking questions what those costs might be so that they can make an informed decision. Maybe the jobs or the lease values in a particular community, in the attitudes in that community outweigh those costs. Maybe there are certain restrictions that a community wants to put in place, maybe not. Maybe communities want to actually put a moratorium or a ban on the practice. All of those are options in a democratic society, you would hope. But you could only do that with information in front of you. Well, what are those local concerns? They could be air pollution concerns, and they certainly, for everyone, should be climate concerns. But I would suspect that most people at a community level are not going to make their decisions on the climate concerns. They're more likely to make decisions on air quality issues, coming from not just the fracking itself, not just the methane, but if you increase truck traffic on rural roads by 100 or 1,000-fold, what does that do to the air quality in a particular area? What does it do to the safety in that area, let alone the air quality? Water quality has probably gotten the most attention. As Aaron just said, there are a set of exemptions that I'll talk about in a minute that might undermine our ability to deal with water quality issues. But those water quality issues have mostly focused on, is the operation of fracking going to contaminate people's wells? On the other hand, there's probably a larger issue, which is what happens to the so-called produced water, the water that comes back to the surface with the chemicals you put in, plus a whole bunch of other stuff that came from very deep in the earth. What are you going to do with it when it gets back to the surface? So while there's been an enormous amount of attention on what's in the chemicals that are injected, it's actually more of a concern of what comes back up than what's been injected. That might include arsenic, it might include radium, and in fact has been shown in some cases to do so, along with lots of other chemicals. Where does it go? I know I live in Gloucester. My town, once a year, and probably in Cambridge or wherever you live, you know, you collect up your paint cans and the little cans of gasoline and you take them to the hazardous waste day at the local dump or recycling facility. Of course, with a fracked operation and you have, say, 1 million to 6 million gallons of fluid that comes back, and you can store it either in a container or an open pond, and then it goes to a treatment facility, in some cases a municipal treatment facility, if there's one available, in some cases an unspecified special treatment facility, but you don't have to identify what's in it, and nobody actually knows where it goes. So there were large numbers of containers in Colorado, which is a big fracking area, again, part for gas, part for oil in that case, stored on site along with open ponds. What do you think happens when the floods came through? a few months ago. So the issue of what you put in the ground is one problem, but actually what you're storing on the surface is another large area to be concerned about. So what's the current policy structure? This, fracking is a new engineering technique, but it's not like we have never had any environmental issues or industrial issues in the country before. So what's the policy structure? Well, I used to be a regulator, and as was mentioned in the introduction, for marine resources. And I had to do National Environmental Policy Act, environmental impact statements before allowing a management plan for coastal areas. You have to abide by the Clean Water Act, and I used to have to deal with, if somebody wanted to put a dock, I had to do a consultation on whether that violated Clean Water Act provisions, so-called 404, Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, clean air provisions, and so on. Actually, the oil and gas industry is not subject to any of those laws in entirety. So for an oil, if you're going to drill a well for oil or gas and frack that well, an environmental impact statement is not required because there's an exemption under the National Environmental Policy Act. A state can require an environmental impact statement. Under the Clean Water Act, if you're going to discharge, as long as the state has said we are monitoring water quality, not monitoring, we're managing water quality, then the Clean Water Act discharge requirements don't apply because that would actually trigger the National Environmental Policy Act. So it's entirely left to the state. The Clean Air Act provisions don't apply to oil and gas in general. Not all of these things date to 2005 when the Energy Task Force from Vice President Cheney, some of them predate that. The Safe Drinking Water Act provisions that require a permit for injection wells do not apply for fracking, except if there's diesel fuel in the fracking fluid. So there's a whole range of exemptions. The Comprehensive Liability Act, Superfund, doesn't apply for oil and gas operations. Effectively, all of the policy, except on federal lands, and there's even challenges to that, are left to the states. Now the question then becomes, are the states capable of handling a big new industrial activity? You sometimes will hear from the industry, well, this isn't new, we've been doing this for 60 years. Well, actually not quite. They have been drilling and pumping water at high pressure down wells for 60 years. They haven't been horizontally drilling and doing high volume fracturing for 60 years. That was the big change. Are the states able to manage this? Pennsylvania have the structure to do it. Does Texas have the structure to do it? Does Montana or Wyoming or Colorado or even California have the structure to do it? A review by Resources for the Future says, well, not really. They actually analyze the adequacy at a state level. But there's been a very, very strong push to make sure that the federal government is actually not involved in the regulation of hydraulic fracturing and unconventional oil and gas development, that it be left to the state level. That's been supported by, according to Common Cause, $700 million in lobbying funds over the last 10 years to ensure that the federal government did not regulate hydraulic fracturing. Even on federal lands, which should be federal authority, recent rules by the Bureau of Land Management have been attacked as being duplicative because the states, to quote someone in a congressional hearing, are managing things perfectly. I was a manager before. I'd never managed anything perfectly, so I probably should go back and learn from the people who are doing it now. So there are real issues that confront people at a state level. Do you have the resources to actually understand what the operation is, to inspect, to allow people within the community to have information available to them so that they can communicate their needs and their concerns? Most state fracking seems to be providing public information through what's called notice and comment. In other words, you have to get a permit for the well. The state informs the community that a permit is being considered. There's an opportunity to comment, and then the permit is issued, or technically it could be withdrawn. If you were doing an impact statement, you would have to propose what you wanted to do and several alternatives and provide a very much more extensive public comment period. So you now know why there isn't an environmental impact statement for these kinds of activities. So you might then ask, well, what about at a local level? This is about communities. And local control of land use decisions is a long-standing tradition in the country. But unfortunately, we've seen actually an erosion of local control in some cases, where in Pennsylvania, there has been a rollback of home rule, which allowed local governments to make land use decisions within their boundaries. And the state has taken back that authority, and the same thing in Colorado, such that in fact, local decisions about things such as a ban on fracking or permit conditions, you may not move forward with any operations within a certain distance from a school or whatever the other permit conditions are being overridden at a state level. Unless you think this is a partisan issue, sometimes that's a Democratic governor and sometimes it's a Republican governor, so it's not actually particularly partisan. So you now have things very concentrated at state level regulation. So how much of these operations are monitored? And the answer is very little. There isn't routine air quality monitoring. There is not routine water quality monitoring. There doesn't appear to be routine inspection in most cases. There is no baseline, so you can judge whether in fact there has been any impact on anything from water quality to air quality to wildlife. So at the state level, the regulations are actually fairly bare bones in most cases. Now, some states have expanded their regulations. Pennsylvania has expanded some of the regulatory authority. California is considering that as well. So what we have is a very, very large scale industrial activity that's growing at really an extraordinary rate, but is largely unregulated. And an industry, of course, doesn't want to be regulated. I don't want to be regulated. I'm sure you don't want to be regulated. I assure you, you don't, because that regulation in an industry sense is cost. So it's clear that we're in a real transition in terms of energy development, but it's going on in a, let's call it lightly regulated fashion all across the country. So finally, what are the opportunities for communities to engage? Well, local land use decisions still are powerful in the country, and connecting to local decision makers who then connect to state decision makers and to national decision makers is still an important opportunity. But of course, if people do not speak out about the information they want or the conditions that they think should be in place if this development occurs in their community, then probably it will continue in this very lightly regulated form. Our regulations don't have to be a ban or a moratorium. They can be a set of conditions. This information should be available to the public on a routine basis. This monitoring should be in place before we move forward. I want to know these things about public health impacts. These studies should be conducted as if development should occur in communities, and other kinds of provisions. That's what I mean by regulation here, not an on-off kind of switch. So the community engagement opportunity is to actually, from a local level right up to a national level, it will not be driven nationally down. That seems very clear from the politics of the current situation. It will come from local level up, with support, hopefully, not just in the communities where this is occurring, but other people who are asking questions about what's the right direction for us to go in energy policy. Thank you.
We'll start with questions and answers then, and you just raise your hand. Remember to speak loudly, if you will, please. I think we can hear, and we will just take your questions.
The only thing I'd add is keep your questions to questions, not comments, so that more people have a chance to ask.
I have two questions. The first is referring to the chemicals that are pushed in. I was unaware that they are actually not, or have been deemed not as dangerous. So just if you could give a brief overview of that and what some of those are. And then as Massachusetts, as a state, since we're not in a position to, have to vote yes or no about are we going to have fracking in our state, is it up to us pressuring other states to not allow that, or is there any way to say we don't want that kind of energy production used in our homes and businesses? Can you regulate it, or is it all kind of mixed together and we don't know what our sources are and where they're coming from? Can we as a state say no?
Sure. I can try and tackle this. So the question about the fracking fluid is a good one. So one of the things that I've found in working on the health dimensions of this is that there's a lot of concern about very specific things when it comes to fracking. There's a lot of concern about what's in the fracking fluids and what that means for groundwater supplies. And in some ways, maybe too strong to say it's misplaced, because I think there are concerns, but I'm much more concerned about the produced water. I'm much more concerned about the water that comes up and how it's handled and processed and disposed of. So in the fluids, it's 90+% water. And the mix of chemicals that gets put into the fracking fluids varies by company. It's mostly, again, proprietary. So only, I think Texas just recently passed a law saying that there has to be disclosure, but in large parts of the country, we honestly don't know. So you sort of have a limited understanding. So of the remaining small percentage that is chemicals, most of the chemicals that are in there are things that we would use in soaps and detergents and sand, and then there's a very small percentage of real chemicals in there, and it's not clear that I wouldn't want to swallow them, to put it mildly, but
Governor Hickenlooper, yes, he
right.
did.
Yes. Personally, I would not want to swallow them. But there's much bigger fish to fry, I think, and I think particularly with the produced water would be the issue. But I think the fact that the companies that are trying to give a face to this practice, that it is safe, that it is economically viable, the question that immediately comes up, well, why aren't you telling us what's in this fluid? I mean, it just doesn't make sense. So I think that's sort of where we're at. We're going to learn more about what's in the fluid as time goes on, because I think that's the way we're headed in terms of disclosure. And we'll learn more about the ultimate fate of those chemicals. So where are they winding up in the environment? Because many of those chemicals are not things that traditional wastewater facility treatment plants would be very good at removing. And the other point that Andy pointed out is, if presuming, in some places where this water comes out of a well and some of the chemicals are in that water and it gets disposed of in some cases at a municipal water treatment plant, in other cases in these specially designated water treatment plants, a lot of these chemicals are in the environment already. We don't know what the baseline level of these chemicals is. So how do we know what's coming from fracking fluids versus not? It's a very, very difficult question.
Yeah, and that actually has been a tactic that's been used quite a bit, just for methane, in fact. So we know that methane migrates, has potential to migrate into drinking water, but probably the fluid doesn't unless it's spilled on the surface, or there's a fault in the well. I agree that most of the fluid is things like biocides to prevent clogging. A lot of sand is used, and sand mining itself is a concern. There's a good blog on our website from somebody in Wisconsin where the sand mining has had a big impact. And of course it's silica. And there are now new silica rules which, guess what, don't apply to fracking operations. So I think the disclosure is this odd patchwork where, there is some disclosure also required in Pennsylvania, but you might move over the border into West Virginia and you wouldn't have to disclose there, but you just disclosed it in Pennsylvania, so I'm having trouble seeing how that's a trade secret if you have to disclose it in some places and not others. I also have trouble understanding how injecting something into a public trust resource is a trade secret, but that's a separate issue. To the Massachusetts issue, there probably isn't economically viable gas resources in the bit of the Marcellus that's in western Massachusetts, although sometime that might become economically important in the shale resources in western Mass. On the other hand, we are a consumer of not only the gas and oil, but also natural gas is an important feedstock for the chemical industry. And so you still have a consumer's role. Whether you can say, well, I don't want anything from a fracked well or not, it's probably not separated out in that way. On the other hand, we have implemented renewable energy standards and other standards that start to separate out sources of power. We can use market pressure, it seems to me, to actually require stronger controls on the operation for their environmental and social impacts. I just briefly referred to social impacts. We should remember in a small community, when you all of a sudden bring in basically a big new industrial activity, you bring in temporary workers from out of state for a short period of time into what may be a small town, there are serious social concerns. And I think there's a very good NPR series called State Impact that looks at those kinds of community level impacts where people really are surprised at what's happening to their towns. Now, maybe that's the trade-off for economic activity, but it's at least something to be mindful of.
And also because we haven't mentioned this yet, a lot of chemical disclosure that is taking place right now is all voluntary on a website called Frack Focus. And a lot of states are grappling with how do you make that information available? Should they just expand Frack Focus, or do they need something which is a little more regimented?
Yeah, there's a list of about 300 things on the Frack Focus site saying any of these things may or may not be in the fracking fluid. So I personally didn't find that very helpful, but I guess if you're steeped in the business, maybe you can figure out what that means.
In the back there.
Yes, hi. The discussion about both the public health implications of air pollution and water pollution, and to some extent whether the public is aware of either of these in different geographies. I'm just wondering if any panel members feel that because the western states seem to have this one big vulnerability that the eastern states, which have undergone fracking by and large, do not have, and that vulnerability is severe, prolonged drought situations. Is it possible that the groundwater contamination issue is finally forcing this into the public domain, and it's in the western states where maybe some states might get put in the ground and the drawing line in the sand, so to speak. And I'm referring to just a little more than a week ago, the November elections in Colorado, where several communities, I think surprisingly, actually said no to fracking. I don't know what's going to happen to that in terms of court challenges, but I'm just wondering if any of the panel members could comment on the implications of this convergence in the western states of drought conditions and fracking or water contamination.
If I can start on that, maybe others want to pitch in. I'm not sure it will be so much water contamination as just water use. If you're taking say 3 million gallons as a sort of middle figure to frack a well, then that's a lot of water at high intensity in a particular place in water depleted areas. And there actually have been some reports from Texas of towns that have run dry. There is no more water in the town because of the demands for fracking operations. And so I think it will just be water consumption. The organization CERES, C-E-R-E-S, has done a very good report on this, which you probably know, since you're nodding. It's really useful to think about what that water stress will do in already water-stressed areas. And interestingly enough, in California, of course, the agricultural community is extremely concerned about allowing additional fracking because they're the major consumer of water and for the entire basin where the Monterey Shale is. So it's a really important concern, but it's not just contamination, it's just the water stress itself.
I wonder if you could, I have an issue, and it's with respect to a state in the South, and there are some things going on. The word fracking is not being used by my contact there. However, I'm talking, what do you think is going on? I'll tell you the concern. There has been recently a depression in a number of acres of land. They know they're drilling. They don't tell us, they don't tell him or the people in the area what they're using. So he tells me, I'm taking him at his word. What I'd like to know is that if you mentioned several of you mentioned databases that I could communicate to him. I wonder if you could make that available to the rest of us. I mean, I would like to be able to think that I could infiltrate, and Massachusetts could infiltrate some of these little towns. These are local issues. But why not use our knowledge here and start getting information to these people? And I have a perfect candidate that I would be glad to start the ball rolling. I mean, I'm just one person, but this is the whole point. Each of us have one person or two or more that we know what they're going through. They don't know, and when I mentioned to him fracking, he doesn't know what that is. I don't think he's going to take the initiative to do anything about it. I'd like to force the point.
So I would urge you to look at the community toolkit, because there are some resources there that allow you to get to, what do we know? How do you get to the resources for the future reports, which have done some analyses of all states of what's happening and what's in place. Several other organizations have done those kinds of broad-scale surveys, and we've detailed many of those in the community toolkit that's on our website, or there may still be copies outside. The subsidence issue, it is, remember, you can horizontally drill for a really long way now because of the advent of the technology to directionally drill, and I suspect what's happening is, if it is connected with drilling operations, it's either from water withdrawal or because they're drilling very deep. But it's hard to imagine how subsidence would occur if it's very deep drilling.
No.
So it's hard to know where.
I think it's probably the water.
It's probably water withdrawal.
Water withdrawal, maybe. Yeah, seems more likely.
But there's a caution in the access to information. So if you went and did a Google search on hydraulic fracturing, you would be inundated with websites that would provide information of variable utility, in my view. So I think the Union of Concerned Scientists website is a good resource both for the reports they've made, but also for access to other materials. But even, Bill was talking about reports of methane emissions. So the U.S. government put out a report that said, I think the average release was 6%, I think, if I remember right. So, is that right? Is that wrong? Well, you'll see numbers ranging from 1 to 12%. And in that range is the sensitive point of whether this is, in fact, a carbon beneficial enterprise. I think one of the things that, I have opportunity to talk to people in industry about this, and the bigger companies involved, I think, understand this. The issue has become so polarized already and so politicized that rational discourse is hard to get into the equation. And we try and have, we're organizing a conference in a couple of weeks in DC about monitoring, because as you heard, monitoring isn't happening. One of the reasons that monitoring isn't happening is because you can't use traditional monitoring technologies to do a good job of monitoring the kinds of exposures we would see. So we're trying to get together some people that really think about new ways of trying to monitor this, but we can't get industry to the table very easily because they're shell-shocked. They think that they're going to be put in a room with a bunch of people telling them that they're the devil incarnate. And the ability to provide good information is not as easy as it might otherwise be, because everyone's got their back up. And there's a lot of stonewalling around information, as you've heard. So it's not, unfortunately, not as easy, but there are some good resources out there, and they should be used, for sure.
And I would add to both the monitoring aspect. One, it's not clear who should be monitoring it. Should it be the responsibility of the federal regulators to be doing this? Or if it's delegated to the states, who should really be reliably monitoring? And also in terms of credible information, just to put another plug in to talk about, depending on what sources of information you're going to, you will hear very different things. And in our report, as well as in our toolkit, we talk about how to assess some information, whether it's credible or not. So I think that would be useful to your friend as well. You had a question?
I had a question that's kind of connected, and I don't know how coherent I'll be about it, but in the area where I grew up, there's a lot of unemployment. And there are a lot of small farms where people haven't had income. And they see this as a kind of economic stability.
Yep.
So how do you
Yeah, it's also an area which has not been very completely comprehensively researched, because there are studies that actually show that the employment that fracking generates in a certain region is not necessarily all local employment. So I think, yeah, so there's,
I mean, the more visibility.
For the lease
For
value.
the lease, yeah.
yeah.
I think the question there is whether people actually have good information in front of them, other than from the land agent, on what's going to be done and what the consequences are and what the deals have been in other areas. I mean, again, this is a difficult decision for people. It may mean economic stability. There is real, money on the table in some cases, and in areas where it's very difficult to find any competing activity. And so that's why it's not a simple, this is all bad or this is all good. The difficulty is that the information that people have for their own land as well as for their neighbors isn't very good. There's two things going on. First of all, people are trying to buy up leases, and so it's a sales job. And there really is an important role for local, state, or federal government, or all three, to be giving people better resources to make those decisions, as opposed to you just listen to the land agent, and if they're really good at convincing you to lease, then you do. The second thing is that confidentiality agreements, which were referred to in passing, are really concerning, because it means that if something's happened, you're not allowed to find out what happened to other people who leased their land, what happened to their resources, and so on. And in some cases, those confidentiality agreements have extended to the children of, to other generations, which starts to get a little bit ridiculous. Like, for, all time, no one can ever speak about what we did on your land becomes a little bit ridiculous. So there is a need for people to have a better way to access and make those decisions. But some people are going to decide, look, there's no other way for me to make a living. This lease opportunity is something I want to do. On the other hand, they might think there's important conditions. This is aside from the climate. There is a larger issue of developing fossil fuel resources. At a local level, a lot of those decisions will be made.
Bill, do you want to add something?
Yes, if I could just add something to that. I think two things come out of this that I think are really important. One is we all know that economies work better and societies work better when there's transparency. I noticed a lot of you really cringed when you heard about these requirements that information cannot be revealed. I mean, even if it turned out that something that could be attributed to this, I'm not saying it is, had happened to your child, you can't say anything to anybody about that. You can't even tell the doctor. Well, what kind of a system is this? Why has our government basically sold out the public in order to meet the needs of the Halliburton Company and the other people who do this sort of thing? That's a really troubling question. The second thing is that this process of getting gas is so cheap that's one of the reasons that the price of natural gas has dropped about in half in the last 5 or 6 years. It's an amazing drop in price. But even with that drop in the price, the cost is still lower. And the point is, these companies could be doing a lot of things to do fracking much better, that is, without all the contamination, without all the leakage of gas and so forth, at a very small additional incremental cost that would still be a better deal economically than coal, which, as we've heard, is really bad when it comes to all the externalities, all the health effects and so forth. So I think there are two issues for these companies that are doing this. One, why won't you tell us? Two, to our government, why did you allow them not to tell us? Why is there no protection of under the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the RCRA, the Toxic Waste Disposal Act? Why is that the case? And let's see if we can't at least begin by changing that so that we know what we're dealing with. Maybe there's no problem at all, but let's at least have it open so we can find out.
One more question, and then we'll have to just be informal.
In the back. Yeah.
I grew up in northeastern Pennsylvania, so classic example of what you just described around small communities being transformed. But I'd like to hear you talk more about the produced water part of it. What are the risks? Typically, how is the water treated, and does it ever get back into the water system?
Well, I guess I can start and others can add. I think there's a variety of, well, what's in the produced water is a little bit unclear. We know in some cases there's arsenic, radium, and other chemicals that are substances that are coming up from deep, as well as whatever was injected, much of which may be relatively benign, but in many cases hard to say. The reason that the Safe Drinking Water Act applies in this case is because it governs what are called deep injection wells. And so when possible, I'm not sure it's a preferred disposal method, but at least a common disposal method is to re-inject that produced water down into a deep injection well in places like Ohio, where, and I think it's usually into a salt formation, but I'm not a geologist, because it's assumed that it won't come back. How much monitoring there is unclear. In other cases, it's stored on site until there can be some disposal method, either to a treatment plant of one form or another. If a municipal plant would take it, then it might go to a municipal plant, or some other sort of hazardous waste treatment plant. And more recently, particularly in places where there's a lot of water stress, like in Texas, industry has started to recycle some of that produced water because they simply can't get enough water. It's not so much because they're concerned about the contamination issues as they couldn't get enough water. They're using brackish water anyway. And so some portion of it is recycled, but you can only do that so many times, apparently. They frack wells more than once through the history of the well. So the whole disposal issue is it's by no means uniform because it varies regionally, it varies from company to company, varies depending on what's in that produced water and how expensive it would be to re-inject it into a deep injection well versus try to get it versus recycling versus store it on site. The storage on site is probably the most immediate risk for contamination of the water table, because the wells themselves are way below the water table. But once you bring it to the surface, if there's leakage, that can get back into the water table, which is where the Clean Water Act surface water discharge issues come in. I don't know if that was
also
helpful.
add that it can be stored on the site, both in storage tanks, but also in open pits. And from open pits, it can be flooded out, or it can leak through the lining of the pits, which is where a lot of contamination has taken place from.
I think your question is well pointed to the fact that we don't know enough about what's in the produced water. And it's sort of shocking given the amount of produced water that's out there, and even with the recycling that's going on, and the companies have every incentive to recycle the water, really, because most of these places don't have water supplies, so they have to truck it in, which is expensive. So much better to just reuse it, but we don't know. And I think there's real risks in terms of contaminating local surface water supplies related to that. So there's certainly a career in there somewhere for people at the School of Public Health.
Probably a good part of Colorado is a good career for exactly that issue. Because of the floods, a lot of that stored water is just washed through the landscape.
I'm sorry, we have to stop here now, but please feel free to go up and follow us.